So Gordon White, thanks for joining me. I'm going to do a little introduction. We've known each other for a while, but the audience might
Oh,
not know you, which is a travesty that I'm hoping to correct.
I don't
Uh,
know. Right.
Gordon's a friend. Gordon's an author, a scholar, a practicing magician, and a permaculture designer that is coming to us from Tasmania, where you have 5 acres.
5 acres on the Commandy River. Yeah.
Right. And prior to that, Gordon, you worked in a number of sort of around the world, from New Zealand to London, in different capacities. Um, uh, as a sort of, I mean, in part, a kind of like millennial data guru in a way. No, is that
Yeah. It started off even before that because I'm early millennial. So I was doing newspaper and magazine jobs in Auckland. And because I was young at the time, it's like, well, do you want to join this digital thing? Because I didn't know stuff. So it was like being that inside newspapers. But because of all the sort of background ad serving stuff and what have you, yeah, data became the kind of through line for the jobs outside of, like, through programmatic advertising and then through demography in different companies in London.
right? And while you're doing that, you started a blog and then a podcast, and now that's become a big part of your kind of livelihood in addition to running your farm. Um, and I discovered you a few years ago. I'd been organizing this kind of annual retreat amongst friends, where we'd find a kind of house somewhere in the countryside. Everybody would descend on it for a week or two, and there was always a theme. And the theme a few years ago was deep history. And a good friend, Ben Vickers, I went to pick him up from the bus station, and we sat down for lunch. And somehow the fact that I had never read Starships came up, and he spent the whole lunch basically scolding me because everything that it seemed that I was obsessed with was already taken care of and fully footnoted in your book.
Taken care of. Thanks, Ben.
Um, and it was really incredible. Your book, I mean, your work, but that book in particular really struck a major chord for me because it felt like it was the book that was missing from every architecture curriculum. So the subtitle of that book is A Prehistory of the Spirits, but woven into that are a number of episodes that are really patently architectural, and not just things that are typically left out of architecture education, but things that without a kind of sufficiently haunted mindset, or kind of openness to ontological possibilities, you can't even see these things in architecture history. So you, as a practicing magician attempting to write a 150,000 year long history, for making sense of your own practice, it was really a kind of silver bullet for bringing things, basically serving the table for an architecture discipline that probably since even before Vitruvius hasn't had the skill set to be able to do that history for itself. So
Mm,
I think there's
good point.
really, I think there's really like a massive project possible in architecture that your research opens the door to. And I'm trying to do my own humble little work to push that door open a little more, and then share it with the next generation of architecture historians, theorists, practitioners, particularly because I'm finding more and more, the students that I teach, um, they don't have the same sort of epistemological hangups that like the even millennials have, let alone Gen X and boomers. So where I wanted to start, the course that I'm teaching this year at the AA with my partner Violette, is tentatively called Ghost Busing. And the idea comes from the fact that this is, it's a 1 week long course, and it's for the first time being taught entirely over Zoom. So it's a bunch of people trapped in their homes. And how do you teach architecture to a class that's totally decentralized, and potentially people aren't even able to go outside and be part of the built environment? So we wanted to teach a class that was about doing architecture domestically. And so the class is going to be about constructing altars. And it's something that we're quickly schooling ourselves on, and we wanted to go right to the source and learn from you. And you taught a course on your online courses not so long ago on ancestors. And in one of the modules, you started with a quote that Conrad Habib had put into had tweeted by Rudolf Steiner, which is human beings on the physical plane will be more and more prone to psychological illnesses as a consequence of the prevailing disbelief in the existence of those who have died. And I think I've heard probably you say somewhere else that because of COVID, because of this moment of, massive amounts of death, or at least death being on our minds all the time around the world, and the inability to actually bury people properly, the world's going to have a ghost problem. And so this class is...
Well, if the world's going to increase its ghost problem, put it that way.
Well, could you say what you mean by that?
It's, if you look horizontally, if you do a cross-cultural kind of sideways glance, and you look back through time, one of the principal and like urgent preoccupations of humans is some kind of being in ceremony or ritual, and the world or the cosmos doesn't go quite right if you're not doing that. And there's a particular elevated concern with moving humans onto the spirit world and the consequences of not doing so. Entire cultures were built on getting that right. I mean, dynastic Egypt being probably the most obvious example. So just because we've forgotten about the importance of it in what Whitehead would call our last 3 provincial centuries, doesn't mean, even if you want to take it on a mere psychological level, and it's an open question what you think psychology is, there's something structurally critical about death rights, and in particular, but sort of rights in general, and being human. And even if the death count, which it will, even if the death count ends up being a bad flu, that's not the ritual challenge, because we've been all sort of atomized into house arrest. We can't do what we're supposed to do, which is gather and perform ceremony. And that's a thing that the archaeological record attests to as it's the first thing we can see in the archaeological record that humans do is some kind of ceremony, going back 150,000 years in Africa, and we're just not doing it. And not just because of the current situation, particularly in whatever we could consider the West, we don't really do it at all. Or if we do, it's weird pseudo-synthetic ones like shopping weekends, annual shopping weekends or something. And it's like, this is what happens if you don't get ritual right. You get it wrong.
Well, and actually, so 150,000 years ago in Africa, and also even almost 200,000 years ago, a cave in southwestern France that was occupied by Neanderthals was found to have a ritual circle with not 1 but 2 hearths in it. So like, why do you need a circle of mammoth bones and stalactites and 2 fires deep inside a cave? So I guess, so one of my questions for you is, the audience of this is going to be mostly an architectural audience, not necessarily a magical or a ritual practicing audience. How do you, one of the questions you often ask on your podcast, you have these kind of really provocative framings, and I like this one, which is sort of like, if you're at a backyard barbecue, what are the sort of like top line sort of facts or statistics or anecdotes or pieces of information that you share with someone that is on a totally different wavelength epistemologically, that is sort of like, well, magic is what David Blaine does, and it has nothing to do with
sure. If you mean a Guardian reader, right? Like, so I'm at a backyard, which means they're wealthy, in Islington, and it's Guardian readers sneering at the. And first of all, you subtly accuse them of racism. That goes down real well, which is essentially that there's this monstrous imperial arrogance in the idea that 95% of the world, so everywhere else and everywhen, including ourselves up until 300 years ago, has it completely wrong. But those kind of like 19th century waistcoated Englishmen traveling around the world, stealing entire continents and clapping people in irons, whilst describing little butterflies, painting them and sending them back to London, got reality right. And if you start there, you either get kicked out of the barbecue, or you've got them on the back foot. So see how that goes. And secondly, you basically need to gauge whether they are in fact aware that we have 150 years, give or take, of lab verified and evidence for psi phenomena, the most obvious one being telepathy. But we have parapsychology institutions, and then once we had psychology departments, the same thing there. 150 years of it, of things that fall outside a guardian reader reality. And that's not like, well, we don't really know what's going on. It's like, no, this is an enormous and rigorous data set that you don't need to pour through the 150 years of, but you do at least need to know is there. And so that's the direction I take it in for people who are kind of like fairly empirical about prove it to me. I'm like, well, come back to me after 150 years of reading, and then we'll have the discussion. Because even inside, and I think it's the wrong philosophical tools to understand meaning, and I think, and I'm not the first person to say that, but a kind of strictly materialist empiricist idea or set of techniques can still indicate to you that a materialist description of reality is at best incomplete. So I tend to start with, like, listen, the evidence for telepathy, according to someone like Dr. Russell Targ, who was, you know, a laser physicist and employed by the Pentagon and the CIA for a decade to do remote viewing, to the tune of millions. He says that the evidence for telepathy is 10 times greater than the evidence that aspirin prevents heart attacks. And that's sort of, that's the statistical significance of something like telepathy. So how does that work if your mind and brain are the same thing? And that's generally enough to get people to go, oh, I didn't mean that. And it opens the door for a conversation. And once you realize that that's in fact the case, then the foundational assumptions, and this isn't just a architecture problem, right? Or architecture challenge is a nicer way of saying it. This is a challenge that's common to a lot of academic disciplines, which is those foundational assumptions upon which it's built itself in the last couple of centuries are effectively falsified. And there are other disciplines like anthropology that I think are further along in dealing with that. I don't think architecture is. I think it interfaces at wrong's the wrong word. It interfaces at a very specific structure of modern society. Like, clients are corporate, clients are government, clients are wealthy. And it's not, whereas anthropology doesn't interface there. So it's the whole kind of legacy of where it will get thought leaders from, and where those thought leaders feed in to the next generation, doesn't allow for the more urgent discussions that other disciplines who have the same challenge have already embarked upon, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you think that, I mean, so we're almost, I think almost to like a couple months apart, almost the exact same age. So we were really
25, if people are asking, carry on.
24 and a half. Our sort of like generation, early millennials, late millennials, whatever you want to call it, were really impacted by the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, right?
Yep.
This sort of like pivotal kind of like becoming an adult, getting
Well, we were in college for 9/11, and then as we sort of try to get our careers going, we get 2008. So yeah.
For me, college was actually the dot-com bubble, because I was a computer engineer in Silicon Valley when it happened. And then I was about to graduate architecture school in 2009. And so I guess what was interesting about 2009 was, like, Obama had just been voted in. This was a moment of hope. And there was also this wave of utopian thinking, and being, you know, just on the like tail end of graduate school, a school that, you know, still had this sort of strains of the history theory department being completely driven by neo-Marxists. So there was this sort of like, you know, from you know, the tiny truncated sliver of the world that you get to experience in school, from the top to the bottom, there was this great euphoria of that the total dismantling of the financial economic system that was promised at that time promised a rebuilding of this kind of utopian future that architects are trained to think about. You know, in a way, obviously to their detriment, because then they get dumped out into reality and they're making $26,000 a year, working 80-hour weeks, and realizing that it'll be 55 years old before they actually get to do their own building. But I'm wondering, you know, that was a moment of transience where, you know, it was just more and more like wealth capture and inequality, and then, you know, you get the kind of fallout of that in the Occupy and Arab Spring, and then it leads us up to COVID and George Floyd and everything we're in now. And I'm wondering, do you place any hope in moments of transience for structural change to the better? Like, I'm wondering strategically, you just talked about how architecture is structured in such a way that it's going to move slower than other disciplines. And you've talked
Well,
about
philosophically or metaphysically, it's going to, right? And that's just the reality of the clients that architecture attracts. I mean, it's governments and corporations and wealthy people, right? So if you don't tend to employ an architect to do a sub-Saharan hut. But yeah, I do think there's hope in moments of chaos. I think there's sort of like almost like the only hope. So when things get ontologically fluid, there's the opportunity to it's easier to move through, I guess, the structure or the field of it. Like it's easier to swim through liquid than solid, right? So yeah, I think there is. And especially as the changes that need to happen are free, like from a monetary perspective. They're not, architecture needs to get itself together and have many conferences and start finding different clients or any of that nonsense, right? It's free. It's actually like, well, hang on. It is a magic of place. Like it's a rearrangement of place. That's what it is. And so if you kind of look at it as a food pyramid, that's things humans have been doing, again, as far back as we can see. And then you sort of move up to different versions of it. And in the West, quote unquote West, right? Like, let's just bracket that. That language of place is currently only expressed in a very specific way of things that it's allowed to be, that what we'd call architecture. But its ancestors are everything. Its ancestors are, we mentioned this before, like Göbekli Tepe and Namta Playa and places. It's if you go down to first principles and go, well, this is a language of place and experience of place and speaking to and with place, then you're playing a different game. You're playing a different game than what is typically discussed, and that's free. That's a discussion you have with yourself, and it doesn't. No one needs to get in the way of that. It's, what do you mean by place? Do you think you live in a living universe, or do you think, as you say, like neo-Marxist historians, they have a kind of, if you're a Marxist, it means you're a Hegelian, but you're a Hegelian who's decided that instead of some sort of cosmic interplay, everything can be materialist. And it's not good metaphysics, even if the class critiques are quite good. Same thing with architecture, right? Like you can drop down personally and go, well, what are my metaphysics? Because you don't find your own. You've inherited someone else's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so I just want to roll back a couple of seconds to what you were just saying. You mentioned Göbekli Tepe and Namta Playa. Göbekli Tepe, which translates, I think, to Potbelly Hill, was a site that was discovered in southern Turkey in the mid-90s by a German archaeologist. It was thought to be a medieval burial ground, so it wasn't touched. And he realized—
Islamic graveyard, yeah. It's unbelievably lucky.
Yeah. So he starts digging it up and he finds these massive, in some cases 5-meter tall pillars, intricately carved with animals that don't even, exist in that area of the world. And as they dig it up more and more, they find that they're arranged in these circles and squares and potentially astronomically aligned. And they were also buried by either their builders or someone that came later, but nonetheless, buried with a carbon datable signature that goes back like 12,000 years, which is to say at least twice as old, if not much more, than the pyramids of Giza, which are supposed to be kind of like, if you tell the pat narrative of ancient architecture in the world's best architecture school, that narrative kind of starts with things like the pyramids, maybe the Sumerian temples, but it's a kind of clean, easy narrative that no one really interrogates or investigates. It's kind of open and shut. Book. There's not enough data to even know anything better, so let's move on and talk about Vitruvius. And what's always been curious to me, or of late has been curious to me, is reading Vitruvius, the oldest surviving Western treatise on architecture, and how fundamentally little he knew about these weird temples that were being, either constructed or even at that point already dug up in Greece. So he's kind of an outsider, clearly not an initiate. There's a whole book number 9 of the 10 is dedicated to a bunch of weird, like ephemera anecdotes about astrology and these things that would have been an initiated kind of course. And in the end, it all distills down into how to make a sundial, so you can figure out, how to find southern exposure for your portico. And so it's always struck me as either Vitruvius knew more than he let on, or he got censored over time or something. But the very, very foundations of Western architecture, which, Vitruvius's book was basically dug up in a monastery in the 1400s, and that sparks the kind of renaissance of architecture. And 500 years of architecture theory in the West have been built slowly, brick by brick on top of that. A guy who knew nothing about what these things were, a kind of normie, looking
Yep.
at these kind of crashed spaceships that had no idea what they were, and effectively cargo culted them into a whole discipline.
Yep.
And so you mentioned Göbekli Tepe, you mentioned Nabta Playa. These are incredibly sophisticated devices. I mean, we both know it was, a retired NASA scientist that did the analysis on Nabta Playa in the Egyptian desert, and found this 12,000-year-old stone circle was charting planets and star systems that took like space telescopes to identify in the 1990s.
And very possibly like the velocity and spin of the universe, and things that a Northeast African herder in 14,000 years ago can't consciously know or have no use for. And the guy's name was Dr. Tom Brophy, if people are wanting to chase him up.
So can you even call that architecture? Like, would you waste the word architecture on that, or vice versa? Would you waste that with the word architecture? Or is it something else?
So I think that's a really good internal discussion. So a live example, I've used anthropology because I like to compare things, which I get from anthropology. But can you have an anthropology beyond the human? Because anthropology has anthropos in there, it's man. So it's study of man. It's like, well, hang on. Is it a study of man? And the last 20 years has been looking at an anthropology beyond the human, because it's in conversation and understanding of animist cultures where things other than humans can be persons. So architecture, it's the same thing. It's the same question, and to answer it correctly to your own satisfaction is sort of like step one of getting out of that infinite. It's almost too strong to say ideological, but like infinite intellectual loop that is self-referential inside Western thought, and as a result of that can't see other things. So that's the sort of jailbreak it needs to do. It's funny, it has a foundational myth that is cosmic. So finding an old book in a monastery is like the beginning story of half the grimoires, right? So it actually has its own kind of like magical journey. But you're right that there's something curious and dysfunctional about it that it needs to look at, which is its foundational cosmic myth is insufficiently cosmic. And that actually happens with things like Hellenistic astrology. So whilst Vitruvius may have only had like a weird understanding of it, or only telling specific things, that was fairly common. So Firmicus Maternus, who is one of the kind of core rediscovered texts for Hellenistic astrology, the same thing. You'll get to points in his book where he's like, and I can't tell you that. Moving on to the next bit. And this is part of the language of understanding what we're understanding, is that you're dealing with a world that has an intimate relationship with spirit that can't be explained, or it would be explained. And that's one of the levels that you want to drop down to when you want to do comparison, because again, you find that everywhere else and everywhere else. But because we're looking at it from modern eyes that have been developed because of not being able to see it, we can't see it. And that's the infinite loop. And it's good. This is what I mean. It's free to change, because you have to do that on a personal basis and drop down and go, well, how do I verify truth? How do I do that? Is it just materialism, right? Like, is that right for me? And that's the journey, not of a career, but of a lifetime. So the good news of where we are right now for any discipline, including architecture, is you kind of have the time to do that.
Well, it's a really good segue, because for me, this sort of attempt to climb that ladder downwards is a recent trajectory in the last, say, 3 or 4 years. You've spoken about this a number of times on your podcast and elsewhere. I think at the age of 7 or something like this, you had some pretty strange encounters. And then, hag attacks and different kinds of dreams and so on. And I've basically gone on a kind of a number of quests to dive into that and test things, and really kind of along the way have, through praxis, but also through kind of like deep thought and scholarship, have cut across so many different cultural forms of magical practice, mysticism, etc., and really have a kind of incredible sort of storehouse of examples from other cultures. So, you know, you've talked already about kind of dropping down and doing this comparative work. I'm curious, what would be, you know, does anything come to mind for you in terms of, I mean, the question I want to ask is like, how does a temple even work, right? And you know, one thing that I really enjoy about your work is, as a chaos magician, you don't subscribe to a particular dogma or tradition. You know, you're kind of a magical anarchist, but you know, with an animist perspective. So there's a kind of deep respect for the traditions that you're drawing upon, and there's also not a kind of implicit Western elitist kind of bias. In fact, it's almost upside down.
Definitely upside down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're much more impressed by cultures that have been successfully doing things with, you know, very rudimentary technology for like 50,000 years and getting pretty spectacular results.
Well, that's simple risk management, right? Like Aboriginal Australian cultures have seen of not one but two ice ages. We can't handle a tiny little bit of warming. Come on, who's the more superior technologist?
Well, so that's a question then, right? Like, Egypt was around for a few thousand years in its,
Yeah.
in its dynastic instance, and it's you know, you've already mentioned this, but it's one of the best examples of a culture that really scaled up those practices architecturally. And I'm wondering, you know, for someone getting started in this, or who hasn't spent, you know, roughly 30 years of their life practicing and studying, you know, what are some bits and pieces that you think are useful, like best practices or kind of metaphysical handholds for an architect attempting to
Sure.
think about architecture as a kind of magical discipline, or a discipline that has that other capacity?
It would surprise me if someone was studying architecture and didn't think that already, even if they didn't realize they were thinking it. Because you do, I did a film degree, and so my background's in like media, Discovery Channel, BBC, whatever. I was looking for understanding the world through adventure. That's what I studied. And I didn't know I was studying that, but that's what I studied. And I think in the case of architecture will be the same. It's like, you think place is magic. You think place is a language you can learn and speak. So like, to open the door a crack into it being, because it is real magic, what you want to do. And this comes back to the psi data, and you end up reading the most remarkable things. Find, to your own satisfaction, something that demonstrates to you that place materially impacts things outside materialism. So a strange example would be the many Soviet experiments of growing crops underneath different structures, including pyramids of different sizes and so on. And the simple fact is, and this was published internationally in the 70s, but people weren't ever quite sure if it was Soviet disinfo or what have you. It wasn't. The stuff underneath the pyramids grows better. So the story of kind of like psi and parapsychology is awash with the language of place, and the language of place in like a capital M meaning sense. So find the thing, and there are many of them. There, you know, there's just the use of resonance. There's the fact that people live longer or have healthier lives in the kind of like golden ratio environment. That's probably the kind of like the temple language that the Greeks were going after, which I suspect, although the Greeks never met someone else's idea they didn't like, so I suspect that was originally Egyptian. Who knows where the Egyptians got it? But you will find anywhere something. You will find that the language of place falls outside how we typically speak it, and find the part of that that resonates with you if you're an architecture student. And it's a thing you can hold on to, which is, okay, this actually happened. These are the data. So place does things that we're not really publicly talking about in architecture, but nevertheless it does. And that's the beginning of a journey that's individualized, right? And I think that's the language. That's the language of place we used to have. Göbekli Tepe is so important because it upends the functionalist dismissal of everything prior to Vitruvius, which is an oversell, but not enough of one, or not entirely one, which is to say that we thought that, you know, we're just hunter-gatherers in temporary structures, and then we learned to grow things, and so we needed like grain silos and houses. So architecture has always been functionalist, and that's just wrong. And it is wrong because Göbekli Tepe shows it's wrong. Before we lived in permanent structures and before we were agronomists of any kind, at least in that area of the world, we built a star temple on a hill using devices and stones that came from, you know, 20 miles away from where it was, and the obsidian that is found there showed that the trade goes all the way through Cappadocia and down to Iran. So we would gather at least once a year when we didn't have houses on this great star temple on a hill, and we did for thousands of years. And there, it's essentially a guitar, right? So it has resonance, and if you hit the central T pillars, they probably create a standing wave. Actually, it'd be very interesting to see what it does, but I wouldn't want to stand in the middle. But so there's this whole kind of like language of stone and star and music, and it was a hunter's temple, so people would get together and probably take some form of hallucinogens and eat meat and drum, and we did that when we didn't have permanent houses. So what we understand place being for, and that's too functional. Our original understanding of language of place, as far as we can tell, is ceremonial. And it's because of those processes that we then move into things that are functional. And so you can come at it any other way, but you need to find the thing that will permanently break the official story of place that you get inside architecture to your own satisfaction. You can find that in history, you can find that in parapsychology, you can find that in, if you want, ghost hunting studies, speaking of the name of the show. Although probably don't find it there. That's a different kind of rabbit hole. It's still fun. But you need to find a thing that will never kind of dissolve dissolve in the kind of vicissitudes of living a materialist life, so that you always know that even if you can't describe it, something you're doing is a kind of magic.
It's super interesting you say that, because I've been, I think as I mentioned at the beginning, for the last few years, I've been teaching a seminar at Columbia University, and I've been using your book Starships as a sort of textbook. At first we read a little bit, by the last time I taught it, it was like each week was another chapter in Gordon's book. And what was interesting was, you know, I started every class with a meditation, and then I'm trying to think what else we did. We did some like Jungian active imagination. Then we did, I think we did some like tarot one day as like kind of an icebreaker. And all along the way, the students kept kind of saying like, when are you going to teach us magic? And we're like, doing magic. But it really required, like, you know, it got to the point where in like week 5 or something, I taught them how to do sigils. And that felt like sufficiently magical that then I think they could, it sort of like broke down their barrier to the fact that magic is kind of like, it's a wide spectrum, and it also has a lot to do with framing and intention and how you look at things. So, but I do have a kind of pointed question for you, which is architecture as a discipline, you know, it's had moments in time where it's had its sort of like autonomy moments, which will be like architecture is architecture and it's nothing else. So forget about the economic or the social or the political dimensions of a building, and instead, you know, design something in a certain way because Le Corbusier designed something similar a long time ago, right? So it's sort of like, let's just, you know, navel gaze and look at ourselves because architecture is interesting enough not to look beyond. But then most of the history of it since, at least, has been kind of grafting on to other currents. So when I was a student, it was, you know, fashionable. If finance was in the news, your studio project would be like, we're going to design a bank. And so you've got someone who knows nothing about finance teaching you, you know, by looking at Wikipedia or whatever about high frequency trading, because that was in the news. And then you get a bunch of like banks that are designed with like a lot of really small rooms, because high frequency trading is about collapsing time down into nanoseconds, right? So you get this sort of like LARPing of the structures of other disciplines as a way for architecture to like reinvent itself. And that feels like one of the primary sort of like progressive arrows in the discipline, that is something that like really turns me off. And so I'm
Yeah.
wondering how to avoid magic becoming yet another one of those, right? Like how to avoid people not doing the exact same building and then just talking about it with a different language and saying place instead of space, or
Well, there's two answers to that. The first one is you probably won't be able to. Um, that's that's just what happens.
yeah.
The second answer is you need to drop down to do it. So what you're describing there is viewed, say, shamanistically, I guess, or shamanically, is an adolescent who hasn't gone through the rites of tribal and place-based connection. So it's sort of playing, it's unhinged, and it's playing a You My Mother with a whole bunch of different stuff, and that's what it's doing. And the thing is, it needs to kind of, we know this, Dr. Donna Haraway, one of my intellectual heroes, would say it needs to stay with the trouble. It needs to stay with the shortcomings of its origins, and also the I hate using the word privilege, but also the very specific power structures that send it in the direction it has, because it will keep doing that. It will keep the kind of art for art's sake thing, like it happened to art. Same reason. Once it starts emerging out of, and this isn't an anti-Marxist comment, it's just tea. Once it starts emerging out of Marxism, it actually can't get back down into the soil. There's a compaction layer. Because it's like, no metaphysics other than dialectical materialism is allowed, and you kind of can't get through it. And that's the bit that needs to happen, and it can flourish. But the reality is, it absorbs fads. Everything does. So two things need to happen. You just need to make peace with that and go on that journey. It will happen. It will happen as long as people are talking about it in that right way, which is kind of like plugging its roots back in. Even if it kind of goes out horizontally from Vitruvius, it's still just Greece, and Greece is the latecomer, excluding the Romans. So the Greco-Roman era is the latecomer in sort of Eastern Med civilizations. And there's a whole bunch of other ones that fed into it. And from them, the whole world fed into them. And that it's a recovery of something that belongs to architecture. It's not an invasion, it's its ancestors.
Yeah.
You need to find your ancestors, basically.
That's okay. So yeah, so then maybe let's talk a little bit more about that timeline. So the one thing that I learned from you and from a guest on your podcast previously, Aaron Cheek, who holds a PhD. He studied the work of Schwaller de Lubitz, who was an alchemist, a chemist, and kind of an architectural historian who went to Luxor for 15 years and measured the temple there down to the millimeter. And then wrote these massive books about, and tapping into some sort of mystical psychology, hermeticism of the moment. But for me, what was really incredible about Schwaller de Lubitz, and this is the essay that's kind of like somewhere on the stack of things I need to do at some point. His first book, The Temple and Man, comes out in 1949. 49 is the same year that Rudolf Wittkover publishes what becomes, the book of, I think it's called something like the Principles of Architecture in the Age of Humanism, which is one of the founding texts of postmodernism. And what Wittkover was doing was he was an art historian at the Courtauld, who would take his students and himself to the Veneto, to northern Italy, and they would just measure a bunch of buildings all the time. That was part of their curriculum, was go and measure and study the kind of the Renaissance. And he was measuring a ton of Palladio buildings and just drawing them over and over and over. And as he stripped away all of the context, so these are like big, like latifundia, basically, these big kind of like working farm villas that had long barchesi around them for the horses and whatever else was being done. Well, if you strip that away, then you get like just a kind of a more classical idealized villa, and then you strip off the ornament and everything else, all the way down to the point where he was drawing the floor plans of these complex buildings just as super, super simple diagrams, and realized that pretty much all of them were built off a single template, right? And it was this massive, just kind of this enormous eruption in the mind of architecture that these kind of what Alberti called the lineaments, that there was something almost mystical about this latent diagram in an otherwise complex building, and that was the heart and soul of architecture. And it was this interesting moment because it was sort of high modernism. It was after the war, but architecture was kind of lost and looking for something new. And what it offered was this sort of flimsy mysticism. But
Ersatz.
what's that? Ersatz, yeah,
Ersatz.
exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, and it was almost as a kind of placebo in a way, because it was actually distilling out anything in those buildings that had any kind of the residue of that earlier age. And actually, George Hersey, who's a very little known Yale professor, wrote a number of books on this. He wrote a book called Pythagorean Palaces, and he was like, well, this guy was dumb because he thought he understood Vitruvius and he thought he understood Palladio because they talked about proportion, but he had no idea what number was. So, for
Yeah.
example, if you have a room that was 8 by 4, whatever, cubits, feet, whatever, Vitkover would reduce that to 1 to 2. That was the ratio. The problem is 4 means something in a magical system.
Yeah, that is 8, particularly for Pythagoreans. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So, but of course that book came later and never caught any action. I think it's an interesting split that, you know, if architecture had read Strahler de Lubitz in 49 instead of Vitkover, we wouldn't be having to have this conversation today. And
Sure.
I'm wondering, like, you know, in an attempt to reintroduce that knowledge and ability to read architecture today, you know, is there I have a temptation that slips into like an engineering mindset. So, for example, John Neal, who was a kind of a student of John Michell, one of the who himself was a kind of student of Alexander Thom, and these were a bunch of kind of British guys, starting with Alexander Thom, who was a Cambridge engineering professor who went out and measured a whole bunch of stone
Yep.
circles. And
Neolithic yard, all that.
right, yeah, and distilled that there was a single kind of unit of measure that was used to kind of construct these things that were thought to be, you know, a bunch of barbarians dragging stones around, even though they dragged them for hundreds of miles and whatnot. And then, you know, a whole generation of sort of fringe archaeologists, architecture historians that are never taught about in architecture school, attempting to make sense of that. And finally, in the year 2000, John Neal published a book that I think is, you know, incredibly brilliant in that he's been able to distill down something very simple, a kind of rule by which you can understand a lot of these monuments around the megalithic world, from the British Isles to Egypt. And in it is a kind of a system of metrology, so a system of units of measure and how you place things in certain places in different ways. And I'm wondering, like, you know, you've done work on the PGM, the Greek Magical Papyri, and this idea of, you know, this is a 2,000 plus year old spell book by a jobbing magician, and you yourself as a practicing magician drawing upon that buried knowledge and attempting to work with it and piece it together and use this great metaphor of frog DNA, like from Jurassic Park. I wonder if you could maybe speak to that, you know, and if there's anything for architects to learn from this sort of frog DNA process, or this, you know, a contemporary practicing magician trying to learn from something that's 2,000 plus years old. And what are the processes by which you would go to kind of jailbreak that or reconstruct it that would be appropriate for now?
Sure. Well, it's almost like you have to paraphrase Jesus, do as Schwaller did, not as he says. So Schwaller, and he was right to do this, kind of dismissed Egyptology's shitty materialist attempt at understanding dynastic Egyptian civilization, which was the most symbolic of the classical or ancient civilizations, right? So Schwaller builds this whole cosmology that you can't just reduce, after finding the Rosetta Stone, this little hieroglyph to mean this sound or that word, and as if it's like a typewriter and these are just the words. It's like, no, if that sound and word is also an eagle or a hawk, then the meaning of eagle or hawk is somewhere in there. So Schwaller realized that the intellectual tools we bring to understanding something like Egypt emerge out of a cosmology that needs to be interrogated. And in his case, like, no. And to his credit, as he said, he spent 15 years, he made his kids spend their summer like measuring out different bits of Luxor. Like he walked the walk of going like, I'm going to do another one because you guys have messed it up, right? Every discipline, anthropology's done it or is in the process of doing it. Architecture needs to come at it that way. Again, there's no avoiding the difficult personal work of looking at the origins of the intellectual tools we use for this process, particularly when it comes to quote unquote the ancients, right? So you mentioned Alexander Thom and things like the Neolithic yard. The measurements that Thom and others found, and it found all across kind of like Northwest Europe, are derived from some fairly crude tools, but a very precise and elegant astronomical understanding of, and more importantly, an astronomical understanding that kind of, in a very hermetic sense, matches the sort of general dimensions of the human body. That's why Schwaller's kind of key idea, at least with Luxor, is that Luxor is in harmonic resonance with the human form. And the human form in Egyptian cosmology, particularly towards the end, but really you can find it anywhere there, is in resonance with the human body. So architecture can be seen or can live in that philosophy or that metaphysics, right? So that's kind of how, it's kind of how you do it. And if you're talking about frog DNA, so in PGM is a collection of fragments from a jobbing magician who was essentially a moonlighting magician. It appears he was a priest at a temple in Thebes in about, it's not 2000, it's in the 300s. And if you look at them, some of the spells are 1 or 2 lines long, and a 1 or 2 line spell doesn't work for us. Would have worked for him because he spent his entire life as an initiate of some kind of god, right? So I use the metaphor of a wall plug. He's kind of like plugged into some sort of capacity to get these to work. Now, we don't have the initiatory tradition that what Vitruvius was probably in some kind of mystery cult, because middle-class Greeks and Romans were, right? Same thing with the sort of foundational writers for Hellenistic astrology. So they had what I would call a wall plug. We don't have that. And so that was the sort of metaphor. The stuff we have from the ancient or classical world is like the dinosaur DNA in Jurassic Park, where it has holes that we, in the movie famously, or also the book, they patch the holes with frog DNA. So we need to find a way of doing that. And that's honestly, when it comes to the language of place, it's individualized. So for instance, I would say the most important frog DNA is like, well, how are you speaking with and about place? How do you understand it? How do you, I'm very inspired by Aboriginal cultural methods of doing it, of referring to, doing acknowledgements of country and referring to land as country and using the word place rather than space. Space is an empty word. There are all these kind of techniques that are modern, that come from modern disciplines of understanding, like anthropology and so on, that we can kind of use to bring something back to a kind of life where it isn't the same thing as it was. So the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park aren't ancient creatures, right? They're mutants, they're hybrids. They're a frog dinosaur hybrid. They're not what they were. And that's also metaphysically significant for when you're doing this kind of stuff, or being inspired by the living language that, again, it belongs to, well, it doesn't exclusively belong to, but it is an ancestor of architecture. The temples in resonance with the human form and stars and so on. That's there. It belongs to the story of humans dwelling, right? And it's the question is how you find your way into it. And for me, I think the most important part is, if you're doing architecture, you need a metaphysics of place, and that can be found in a contemporary intellectual or philosophical approach.
So that's also, again, a really nice kind of alley-oop, because we're drawing to the end of the conversation, and I wanted to get to the kind of, I guess, utilitarian part or something, where I get to kind of pick your brain for this class that we're about to teach. And our approach, Violette and I, is we've got students that are going to tune in over Zoom for like a week. They're going to be all over the world, so they're going to be in their own place. Some of them may be under house arrest at this point. Some others may be a little more mobile. But our thought was to start, it's only a week, so instead of designing a whole big building, and in the course that we taught last year, we actually brought all the students out to the AA's countryside campus, where we have incredible wealth of like CNC milling machines and stuff, and a forest to cut down trees and make stuff. So we built a ritual float tank, which was great fun. And we attempted to bring, you mentioned the sort of rudimentary tools. We tried to, swing pendulums and watch Venus move from one tree to the next to make timing and figure out different lengths of objects and stuff like this. And this year the idea is to make an altar. And from you, I've learned kind of rudimentary ways of building a kind of very simple kind of Boveda ancestor altar. But I'm curious, altars are a big part of buildings. The guy that I mentioned earlier, George Hersey, he actually looked into the language that the Greeks used for the different aspects of Greek temples. So not just the column and not just the capital, but the third donut after the second donut that has a braided whatever. And he found that, through Greek language is built a lot on tropes. So certain things kind of sound alike and they rhyme with each other. And there's a meaning structure there. It's not just accidental. And he found a lot of troping that related in the structure of ornamentation of those columns, the very things that Vitkover threw away right away so he could make his diagrams cleaner.
Yeah.
Actually were the same words that were used to build altars in the forest for pagan rites, right? So there's a kind of implicit almost calcification of altarpiece into the fundamental ornamentation of architecture in the Greek Western tradition that leads to 2,000 years of different theories about how we make buildings and proportions and so on. So I'm curious if I could put you on the spot, just, how would you do that? How would you kind of bring in a novice group of architects that are probably not magically operant? And do you think that starting to construct or think through an altarpiece is a sort of potential slippery slope into basically of kind of climbing down to here to do that?
Yeah, if you take it seriously, it can be, right? So in theory, in architecture, you can have two places occupying the same space, right? Like a really basic bitch example is kitchen dining. But a place can be two places at once. That's, even if that isn't interrogated, that's the case. Now, an altar is such a place, right? And if you come at it in that respect and realize that it's two places at once, this is what the ornamentation you're talking about there. Even ornamentation is kind of like too violent a word, because everything that's in that place is also in another place. So in New Kingdom Egyptian understandings, some New Kingdom Egyptian understandings, a statue of a god is its shadow in the physical world. So that's how they understood where, and it's also one of the reasons why they would veil the statues as they would sort of parade them through the cities and so on, because only the profane eyes weren't allowed to see it. But that's how seriously they took a physical structure, that it was, well, a physical object. So a statue of a god wasn't the god, but it was its shadow in the material. And if you can kind of sit with that idea when you're doing your own kind of work on what an altar is, that it is two places at once. It is here and it is there, and that there is a very serious and ancient metaphysics, or even contemporary, because again, most of the world thinks like this. It will feel right when you do it, and that's the strange thing, because obviously I have the site where I teach people magic and all the other stuff that whatever they end up voting on, right? People know how to do it already, and that's weird. You almost just have to give them the intellectual permission to take this a bit seriously, not do it as a larp like ha ha ha, but realize that this place is two places, and that the things that are on it can be the shadows of something from somewhere else. And that's enough to start having, and this, I don't want to scare people with this, but that's enough to start having strange effects from having an ancestor altar or whatever it happens to be, particularly if you're coming at this cold. If you have never done anything like this, and you start realizing that there is a kind of almost universal language of what an altar is, whether it's a building or a rock in the forest or above a hearth, or even a hearth, like the hearth is metaphysically very dense. You kind of know it, and that's the two, like, realize it's two places at once, and that the things that are on it can be shadows of something from elsewhere, and you'll start to how you think about it or how you describe it will start to begin, all the words will have capital letters, like it will feel a bit more important or more significant, capital S, than you initially thought.
So there's in the sort of timeline of kind of megalithic architecture history that we kind of scattered through or sprinted through earlier. The guy that I mentioned at the end of it, John Neal, one thing that I think is, and even Schwaller de Lubitz, I mean, for Schwaller, you know, he equates the temple to the human, but then the human kind of becomes a microcosm of the microcosm, or the macrocosmos, right? So there is this sort of like nesting of scales that I think starts to happen when a structure, an architectural structure, starts to become potent, right? Or for example, like, you know, the Great Pyramid famously is a kind of model of the earth. You know, the height of it is kind of like the polar diameter and the circumference and so on. So it seems like one of the commonalities in these larger lithic structures of architecture is modeling something sacred, whether it's the earth or human, or finding that confluence where if you squint at it, or if you abstract it. And this is where I think, you know, the concept of typology in architecture, whether it's a Greek peristyle temple, or it's a pyramid, or it's a stone circle, or it's a cave, you have different typologies, but they all seem to be blending different systems of cosmic significance in a way where if you can fudge it a little bit, if you can rationally create something where you're basically making a link between space and time and place and shape, something powerful seems to happen. And you actually turned me on to a video. Earlier you said Göbekli Tepe, it might create a standing wave because it's a kind of, you know, you slap the columns and they hum. You said, I don't think I want to stand at the center of them. You sent me a video, like I think years ago, of Christopher Knight talking about standing at the center of one of these stone circles when they were heated to their Curie temperature, and the magnetic field actually kind of formed a focal point. And he says he was psychic for 3 days, right?
Yeah.
So
it was at the end of a series of stones in Brittany, I think. Yeah, and he stood in them, and he said he was 100% clairvoyant for 3 days. There's stuff that happens with this that you don't, and crucially, you don't need to form any opinion whatsoever, and certainly not a fixed one. And you certainly don't need to solve to your own satisfaction how you think stone circles and megalithic architecture, quote unquote, work before you become inspired by this notion, right? And it is, so here's the thing. If you're given its ancient Greek DNA, there's the idea, we mentioned the, you know, golden mean, golden ratio, the rest of it, the classical Greek everything was harmonic. So and that was by design. So you kind of have the tonal scale and the sort of ratios of buildings and so on are all the one thing. It's all supposed to be in this grand cosmic harmony, which by the way works. And again, you can kind of you see that with the different tests with growing plants and all the rest of it. But architecture's kept the conversation binary in the same way music has, where it's either tonal or atonal. And that's not right. What you just said there, like the idea of being in resonance or kind of like a fractal with is the actual language. So it's not just finding where it is on the sine wave and going, okay, well, we're just going to use this. It's the fact that you can make a small frog be in resonance with all frogs. And that's the kind of fractal harmonics almost. Again, people kind of take it in a musical or physical direction, and you can, but that is just one example of it. There's one example of it the Greeks went ham on, but it emerges from this much more older and more horizontal idea that a thing that you make is in some kind of resonance with the thing it depicts. And that's the kind of language of stars and stones and pyramids and so on. And architecture comes out of that and doesn't realize it. And it means when you're talking about the language of place and concepts is that this is the sort of shadow of the God thing. There is a fundamental, and it's weird, resonance between a depiction of a thing and a thing. And that's what I think people in architecture it would be nice for me if they found that, because if you keep the conversation tonal, atonal, what will just happen is that you'll just get a swing back to a kind of like classical or conservative phase or fad within it. It's like, okay, well now we're just going to do the like classical proportions again and then come back. And that's the wrong, I mean, you could do it. That's not what we're talking about. It's not just, is it tonal or atonal? It's tonal atonal comes out of something fundamental about the universe, which is that a thing is in some kind of relationship with what it depicts, and that is available for architecture to recover and run with.
You closed at exactly 1 hour, so I think we'll let that be the last word. Thank you so much, and we'll report.
You're welcome.
Back. We'll let you know what we make. Maybe you'll
nice
feel
one.
Cosmos.
Yeah, excellent. I can only hope.
Okay, I'm gonna thank you, Gordon.
Oh, good.